She was a Japanese female prisoner of war. He was the American soldier guarding her camp, and she was about to fall in love in a place where love was impossible. She had been taught that capture meant torture and dishonor. So when the enemy guard reached toward her, she flinched, expecting a blow. But in his hand was not a weapon. It was a simple bar of soap. He never spoke more than he had to. He followed the rules. But his gestures told a different story. The way he'd place her food ration down gently. The extra blanket he left without a word on a cold night. These small acts of kindness were more dangerous than any weapon. Because if the enemy was not a monster, then what was he? The feelings that grew between them were forbidden by his rules and by her honor. But the most dangerous secret wasn't that an enemy could be kind. It was what would happen to her if she ever dared to tell anyone back home the truth. How do you choose between survival and honor when an act of mercy from your enemy feels like the greatest betrayal of all? We are truly interested to know where these documented accounts reach. Please share in the comments where you are watching from and your local time. If truth, mercy, and memory matter to you, subscribe to help keep these stories alive. It was the spring of 1945. The war was in its final desperate months, but here, on a forgotten island near the Philippines, the world had shrunk to the size of a makeshift camp surrounded by wire. Across the Pacific, thousands of Japanese women, nurses, clerks, civilians caught in the sweep of battle were finding themselves in a situation they had been taught was worse than death, prisoners of the Americans. They had been raised on stories of the enemy's barbarism. The Emperor's radio had promised that the Americans were monsters who would torture, dishonor, and enslave. Every woman who stood shivering in the humid air believed that her life, in any meaningful sense, was over. Surrender was the ultimate shame, a stain that could never be washed away. She clutched a thin, ragged coat around herself, a garment that had seen better days in a life that now felt like a dream. She kept her eyes fixed on the muddy ground, a discipline of humility and fear. When the American guard stopped in front of her, she did not look up. She felt her body tense, every muscle preparing for an impact, for the cruelty she had been assured would come. She heard the soft rustle of paper, then his boots shifting slightly. A shadow fell over her. Her instinct was to flinch away, but she forced herself to remain still. To show fear was to invite worse. Then, something was extended toward her. It was not a weapon, it was not a blow. Slowly, she raised her head. The guard, a young man whose face was etched with a weariness that seemed too old for his years, held out his hand. In his palm rested a small, pale bar of soap. She stared at it, her mind struggling to make sense of the object. It was not a trick, it was not a threat. It was simply soap, real and solid. Its scent, faintly clean and unfamiliar, cut through the damp, musty air of the camp. With a trembling hand she reached out and took it. The soap was smooth in her palm, a small island of order in a world of chaos. In that single quiet moment, the carefully constructed story of her life began to crack. This simple act of mercy was something her world had no words for. It was a gesture that did not fit the narrative she had been given. In the days that followed, the confusion only deepened. The camp was run not with the random cruelty of monsters, but with a strange and predictable order. The guards followed rules from a book called the Geneva Convention, a code of conduct for prisoners that Japan itself had refused to sign. Here, under the watch of their enemies, the women were treated with a distant but consistent respect. They were given chores, scrubbing latrines, mending uniforms, preparing meals under supervision that gave a rhythm to their days. Medical officers checked on the sick. Red Cross parcels sometimes arrived, bringing with them small comforts that felt like luxuries from another planet. And there was food. Every day they would line up with their metal bowls, and every day they would be given rations. She would never forget the first time they were served a hot broth. The steam rose in the cool morning air, carrying a scent of vegetables and salt. She watched the other women, saw their hesitation, the same fear she felt reflected in their eyes. Was it poisoned? Was this some new, cruel form of torture? She took her portion, her hands shaking so much that the hot liquid threatened to spill. She returned to her corner and looked at the soup for a long time before taking the first tiny sip. It was only broth, but it was warm. It was real. She ate slowly, stunned that she was being nourished instead of starved. That night, she found a small, discarded scrap of brown paper from a food package. It was a priceless treasure. Using the charred end of a stick from the cooking fire, she carefully formed the characters of her language. Her hand was stiff, unaccustomed to writing. She wrote 2 simple sentences. "I am alive. I have not been harmed." She read the words over and over, as if to convince herself they were true. But as she sat there in the darkness, another thought crept in, one that brought a feeling of unease that was almost as strong as her fear had been. If the enemy was not the monster the radio had sworn they were, then what else was a lie? If the stories that had defined her entire world were breaking apart one by one, what was left to believe in? The foundations of her identity, her duty, her emperor, her nation, felt like they were turning to dust. She folded the small piece of paper carefully, hiding it in a seam of her coat. It was a secret, a testament to a truth that she could not speak aloud. The next day, she saw him again, the young soldier who had given her the soap. He was walking the perimeter, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He was just doing his duty, walking a line he had walked 100 times before, but this time their eyes met across the yard. It was only for a second, a fleeting connection in a place designed to keep them apart. She saw no conquest in his gaze, no pride of a victor looking upon the vanquished. She saw only that same deep fatigue, and something else, something that looked like a shared understanding, something like mercy. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod before looking away, his face returning to the neutral mask of a guard. But it was too late. The glance had been exchanged, a silent conversation had begun, and she was left with a new and terrifying question, one that echoed in the quiet chambers of her heart. In a world where every rule was meant to separate them, she wondered if such a thing was even allowed. The days settled into a rhythm, an ordered pattern of survival that pushed the chaos of the war just beyond the wire fence. For the women, life was defined by discipline and chores. They cleaned the latrines, their hands raw from the harsh soap. They mended uniforms, their needles moving with a practiced, steady motion. They prepared the daily meals, measuring out rice and vegetables under the watchful eyes of the guards. This routine was a strange kind of comfort. It was predictable. It was safe. It was nothing like the brutal stories they had been told. The Geneva regulations, which meant so little to their own government, were followed here with a surprising strictness. Doctors made rounds. Names were recorded on official lists for prisoner exchanges that might one day come. Everything was accounted for. Every person was a name, not just a faceless enemy. It was a cold administrative kindness, but it was a form of kindness nonetheless. She learned to live within this new set of rules, to find her place in the quiet hierarchy of the camp. Among the guards, one stood out. It was the young soldier, the one who had given her the soap. He was no older than 23, with weary eyes that had seen too much. He walked his assigned perimeter with a steady, unhurried pace. He distributed the food rations with an efficiency that was never rushed or rough. He was a man of quiet actions. When a woman was ill, he made sure the medics were notified. If a jug of water was empty, he refilled it before anyone had to ask. He never spoke more than was necessary, often relying on the Japanese-American interpreter to relay orders. He was just a soldier following his training, yet she saw something more in the way he moved. There was a deliberation in his gestures, a gentleness that seemed out of place in a uniform. She watched him apply a bandage to another woman's cut hand, his movements careful and precise. He was not a monster. He was a person, and that fact was becoming both a comfort and a danger. Weeks passed, turning into a month, then another. The seasons began to shift. The silent connection between them grew, a fragile thread woven from shared glances and unspoken understanding. She started to learn his schedule, the times he would be on duty, the path he would walk. One day, as he was handing out tins of fruit, she found the courage to speak. She had learned a few words of English in school, words that had felt useless until now. As he placed the tin in her waiting hands, she looked at him directly and whispered the 2 words she had been practicing in her mind. "Thank you." The sound was small, almost lost in the noise of the camp. For a moment he froze. His eyes met hers, and she saw a flash of surprise, maybe something more. The rules forbade familiarity. A smile would be a violation. So he did not smile. He simply gave a short, stiff nod, a formal acknowledgement that could not be punished. But the moment hung in the air between them, a shared secret. Another time he was carrying a crate of tinned peaches, and one slipped from his grasp. It fell to the dusty ground, rolling toward her feet. Without thinking, she bent down, caught it, and stood up to hand it back to him. For a fleeting second, as he took it from her, their fingers nearly touched. It was a spark of contact in a world built on separation. They both pulled back instantly, their faces unreadable, and he moved on without a word, but the almost touch lingered, a warmth that spread through her long after he was gone. Both of them knew the strictness of the rules. Fraternization was a serious offense, punishable for both prisoner and guard. Yet in the shared misery of the camp, in the quiet dignity of a bar of soap, a warm meal, and a returned can of peaches, something was growing. It was not love, not yet. It was something more fundamental, the simple, profound recognition of another human being. It was a fragile peace in the middle of a global war. Then, one afternoon, the peace was shattered. A wave of shouting and cheering erupted from the American side of the camp. The guards were hugging each other, throwing their hats in the air. The news spread like wildfire, carried on the wind and through the broken translations of the interpreter. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. For the Americans, it was a moment of pure joy, of relief, of victory. But for the Japanese women, the news was a death sentence. They sat in stunned, silent disbelief. The world they had known, the emperor they had revered, the nation they had been willing to die for, it had all collapsed. For her, the feeling was not relief. It was a profound and suffocating humiliation. Her identity, her purpose, her entire sense of self had been tied to the idea of a victorious Japan. Now she was not just a prisoner, she was a member of a defeated nation. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. That evening she saw him walking his post. Their eyes met across the yard as they had so many times before. But this time he looked away. He did not hold her gaze. For the first time he avoided her. In that moment, she understood a new, terrible truth. Mercy was not a permanent thing. It could vanish with a change in orders. Kindness was a privilege, not a right. And with the war over, the rules had changed, and she was once again nothing more than the enemy. The announcement of surrender changed everything. The tense, quiet order of the camp dissolved into the organized chaos of demobilization. Within weeks, the transport ships began to arrive, huge gray vessels that promised a return to a life she no longer recognized. The women were processed with a methodical efficiency that felt both kind and unnervingly impersonal. They were led to showers, where they washed away the grime of the camp with the last of the American soap. They were handed clean, donated dresses in faded floral patterns, clothes that felt foreign and flimsy on their bodies. They were given parcels of food and supplies for the long voyage home. It was all part of the procedure, a checklist being ticked off by men who were now simply administrators, their role as guards finished. She looked for him during these final days, but he was gone from his usual post. He had been reassigned, his duties in the camp concluded. She felt a hollow ache, a sense of an unfinished story. On the day of departure, as the women were herded in long lines toward the gangplank, she saw him. He was standing near the main gate, separate from the others, his hands clasped behind his back. He was just a solitary figure in a uniform, watching the slow procession. Their eyes met one last time across the crowded, chaotic dock. There was no opportunity to speak, no space for a gesture. But in that final, sustained glance, everything that had passed between them was present: the soap, the nod, the almost touch, the shared humanity. It was a goodbye that held the weight of 100 unspoken conversations. Then the line moved forward, and she was forced to turn away, walking up the ramp and onto the ship, leaving him and that small, fragile world behind. The homecoming was not the triumph she had once dreamed of. The Japan she returned to was a ghost of the one she had left. Her village was a landscape of ruin, where scarred earth and blackened timbers marked the places that homes once stood. The air tasted of ash. She learned that her father was gone, lost in one of the final, desperate battles. Her brother had returned from the war, but he was a changed man, a soldier of a defeated army, carrying a shame so heavy it bent his shoulders and silenced his voice. There was no celebration for her survival. Instead, there were whispers. The neighbors, their faces gaunt with hunger and loss, would stop talking when she approached. She could feel their eyes on her back, their questions hanging unspoken in the air. A woman captured by the Americans. What had happened to her there? In the rigid code of post-war Japan, a female prisoner of war carried a unique and terrible dishonor. To have survived capture was to have failed in one's duty to die. To have been in the hands of the enemy invited suspicions that tainted her family's name. She learned quickly that she could not speak of what she had endured. To talk of the hunger and the fear was acceptable, expected even. But to speak of the soap, the peaches, or the quiet kindness of a guard, that would be seen as a betrayal, a collaboration with the enemy. The mercy she had received was a truth too dangerous to tell. The love she had felt, if love was the right word for something so silent and forbidden, became an unbearable weight. It was a memory with no place in this new, broken world. It was a secret that isolated her completely. One evening, sitting in the shell of her family's home, she reached into the seam of her old coat and pulled out the small, folded scrap of brown paper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The charred characters were still there, faint but clear. "I am alive. I have not been harmed." The words, once a source of secret comfort, now felt like a cruel joke. She was alive, yes, but her life felt like a form of punishment. She crawled toward the small cooking fire, her fist clenched around the paper. For a long moment, she held it over the flames, watching the edges curl in the heat. To burn it would be to erase the memory, to give in to the silence, to accept the shame that everyone wanted her to feel, but she couldn't do it. It was the only proof she had that a moment of decency had existed in the middle of all the hatred. With a ragged breath, she pulled her hand back. She carefully folded the fragile paper one more time and slipped it inside a book, burying it between the pages. She would not destroy the memory, but she would seal it in silence. As she closed the book, a cold, hard certainty settled in her heart. Mercy, it seemed, was not safe to trust. It was a fragile, temporary thing that the world could not understand. Her world did not punish her for the suffering she had endured, but for the simple, unforgivable fact that she had survived it. Decades passed. The scars on the land began to fade, covered over by the relentless green of new growth and the gray concrete of new cities. Japan rebuilt itself from the ashes, its cities rising taller and brighter than before. America, the conqueror, slowly transformed in the national consciousness into an ally, a trading partner, a distant and complex friend. The war became history, a collection of stories told in books and solemn documentaries. Through all these changing years, she lived a quiet life. She never married. The silent questions that had followed her home from the war had made a quiet, solitary path the easiest one to walk. She found her purpose in a classroom, becoming a teacher, shaping young minds that knew the war only as a chapter in a textbook. She taught them grammar and literature, and she taught them with a gentle patience that she had learned in a place they could never imagine. In the private, sealed-off corners of her memory, the camp remained. She would sometimes close her eyes and see the young soldier's face, not as a figure of romance or impossible love, but as a fixed point of decency in a world that had lost its way. She remembered the feeling of the soap in her hand, the surprise of the warm broth, the unspoken kindness in a shared glance. These were not ghosts that haunted her, they were quiet reminders of a truth she had been forced to bury. As the years went on, the country began to speak more openly about its past. Former soldiers, now old men, gathered for testimonies. They spoke of the horrors of the labor camps in Siberia, the beatings, the starvation, the bone-deep cold. Their stories were powerful, filled with a righteous anger and a profound suffering that demanded to be heard. Theirs became the official narrative of the Japanese prisoner of war experience. She would listen to these accounts on the radio or read them in the newspaper, and a familiar sense of isolation would settle over her. The stories of the women who had been captured were rarely invited into these public remembrances. Their experiences were softer, quieter, and somehow considered less important. And her own story, a story not of cruelty but of unexpected mercy, felt utterly out of place. It seemed small and insignificant next to the grand tragedies of the men. She began to question her own memory. Did a small act of kindness from an enemy guard even matter when so many others had endured so much worse? Did her story even belong in the history of the war? To speak of mercy felt like a betrayal of those who had received none. Silence, it seemed, was the only honorable choice. One afternoon, standing before her class of young students, she looked at their curious, unlined faces. They were learning about the war, about the dates of battles and the names of generals. To them, it was a story of armies and nations, of grand strategies and unconditional surrender. There were no people in their textbooks, only figures. There was no confusion, only victory and defeat. And in that moment she realized a profound and terrible truth. Silence was not honorable. Silence was another kind of prison, another kind of death. By staying quiet, she was allowing the complex human truth of her experience to be erased. She was letting the simple narrative of monsters and victims be the only one that survived. To remain silent was to agree that a small act of humanity had no value, and she could not, would not, let that be the final word. Her decision was not born of anger or a need for recognition. It was born of a duty to the truth, a duty to the memory of a young man who, in the middle of a war, had chosen to be kind. The next day, she did not open the official textbook. Instead, she stood before her class and began to speak. Her voice was steady, calm, and clear. She did not tell them a story of forbidden romance or dramatic escapes. She told them a simpler, more powerful story. She spoke of what it felt like to be a young woman who believed she was about to die, a woman who had been taught to hate the face of her enemy. Then she told them about a bar of soap. She explained how a guard, an American soldier, had given it to her without a word. She told them how he had ensured the sick were tended to, how he had treated them not as spoils of war, but as people. She explained that this small, quiet decency, in a place built for despair, was the thing that had kept her spirit from breaking. She was not just teaching them history, she was teaching them about humanity. She was telling them that even when the world is divided by barbed wire and propaganda, a single, simple act can create a space where dignity can survive. That evening, in the quiet of her small home, she took out the old book where she had hidden her secret for so long. She found the scrap of brown paper, now yellowed and fragile with age. The writing was faded, but the words were still there. "I am alive. I have not been harmed." She looked at them, and for the first time in decades they brought no shame, only a sense of profound peace. She carefully took the note and placed it inside the pages of a new diary, not to hide it, but to preserve it. It was no longer a secret to be buried, but a testament to be honored. She had finally learned that real honor is not found in conquest, nor in dying for an emperor, nor even in the silence of enduring great suffering. True honor, she now understood, is found in mercy remembered. It is found in having the courage to speak the name of a kindness that was never supposed to exist.